Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Hi everyone and welcome back to the podcast. I last spoke to Martin Smith 3 years ago. We talked about his local river, what it meant to him and what he was doing to protect it from a nearby sewage treatment works. It got quite a reaction and I want to get an update. Martin, it's good to have you back on the podcast. Are you well, sir?
I am. Thank you very much.
It's great to have you along. And I thought we'd kick off before we start talking a little bit about the river and what's happened since. Get a sense of your season. How's your season from a fishing perspective been?
Very minimalistic. There has been so little time available. The PFA is an absolutely wonderful club with a very long record, and combined with the Costa Angling Club, which we took over their waters in the 50s, our records go back into the 1870s. And they were reformed then, so I just can't tell how far back they go. But the amount of work that we've had to do, I think I had 2 days of fishing on the Duchy, so we were on the King's Estate of Pickering Beck. I took a guest who'd bought one of the auction tickets from either Wild Trout Trust or Wild Fish, I can't remember, and got him fishing. And I managed to fish for about an hour and a half, and I got 8 fish. And then the next day I went on my own because we were staying local, and I managed to get 12. And it was very low water, very slow, fish very spooky. You had to crawl up the riffles and fish from there into the pools, but absolutely wondrous. And I've had a couple of other little visits, but nothing much, but nothing on the rivers. I've been either late on the ponds to get a couple of stockfish for neighbours, or else those 2 visits on the river. Yeah, but as you will find out later, lots more been happening. But yeah, as a fishing season goes, what's fishing? I hear about it, but I don't get to do it.
And do you get that sense, because obviously your role within those clubs is a extremely busy one, so I guess you're getting a lot of feedback. Are you hearing from anglers how it's been up there? Has it been a challenging season?
Well, education has been a big thing this year. We're very fortunate in that we've got a young angler by the name of James Atkinson, who's in the England team. In fact, he won one of his sessions in the World Championships recently. And he slaughtered everybody on that particular day. But a very, 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 very accomplished angler. During the COVID season, he had the privilege of being a river champion for about 3 years, I think, instead of 1 year. So he kindly came along, having joined the club, which he's enjoying. He kindly came along and did a demo day for us, which was absolutely staggering. His attention to detail, from an elastic band from the chassis of the reel to the hub of the rod to stop the line looping around the back. You might miss 2 seconds with a nymph in the water if you're not careful. He had a spiral of nylon around the top section of his rod. And I'm not sure if I haven't seen an Orvis Trident or something with something like it manufactured. And we all focused on it. He said, it's to cut down the surface tension when you're nymphing with straight line. But he went from his boots to the top. Lunchtime, he stopped, did the barbecue. While he was doing the barbecue, he was talking about his flies to people. He just didn't stop. And in the afternoon, he did the dry fly session. So he's also been very kind because he needed to raise money for his World Championship expedition. He's been doing charitable stuff. So he's been teaching members, and they've maybe gone to the wharf or somewhere like that and fished. He's not used the club to make money. It's just if members want to pay for a guide to come and teach them, he's the guy. And members have gone and said, I was scratching on Pickering and I got 1 or 2 fish. I fished with James and I caught 20. So it's hard to say how well the fishing's going because they're supercharged with this World Championship class angler teaching them how to do it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it makes it for me because I picture those rivers, and you're based, for listeners that don't know, in Yorkshire, and Pickering Beck and Costa Beck. I always get the sense they're quite challenging waters to fish, and difficult waters to fish. Would that be right?
Um, Pickering Beck is probably the go-to river for most people. It's the river where people say if we get too many members, they'd be upset if they couldn't get on there. It's a banker, really. You can go and fish there and you will catch fish. Costa Beck is the subject that will come back several times throughout this conversation, I hope, which has been challenged in terrible ways. But this year and last year, this £5 trout has been caught each time. I have a leather-bound book here. We're not on a video, so it's no point showing you on a radio or a podcast to look at this. There's a leather-bound book in here from 1872. And in 1879, the keeper records that they didn't need to stock with Loch Leven trout for their growth because they've caught a 9 3/4 pound trout on the Costa. There were pike up to £32. It was wick with fish. But the Costa has suffered. We've got fish trying to come back, but there are perennial problems driving them out, which we'll come to later. The tighter waters are what some people call jungle warfare fishing, are on the Duchy where it's less tended, and we've just got another 2 miles of double bank fishing, and it's not been touched. It is virgin water. It is as God intended it. Trees fallen down in it and everything. So that's going to be 2 miles of double bank fishing on Pickering Beck to the north of the Duchy, where the fish have probably never seen a hook or an angler. So that's going to be very exciting. It's a long-term project, and our Facebook recruitment for this year will probably focus, or for the next season, will focus on attracting those kind of people so we don't overfish Pickering Beck and Costa. And then we've got Thornton Beck, which again is knee pads, bow and arrow casting, roll casting. And I cannot believe how many people have fished it this year. They've absolutely loved it. And James Atkinson fished it 6 foot 3-weight rod, and he went on the lake next to it at Pexton and caught a 10-pound trout on a 3-weight 6 foot. And how on earth he did it, we've got no idea. He could fish for England, or he does.
Fantastic. And from a fishing perspective, that's what you're describing. It sounds amazing. And I'm interested from the club point of view, because I know we've talked about it with James on here, or Boo, and about clubs. And like you say, the recruitment for next year, given environments, given fishing clubs and the challenges that they have to face, does that mean having that extra 2 miles has given you an added selling point? Do you struggle recruiting and finding members in this environment, or is it a relatively straightforward process for you?
Gosh, I've got to try and think of giving you the proper answer here. If I strip this back to the basics, from the records that I see, in the 1800s, and you went fishing there, you probably were a clergyman, retired officer, etc. That may have been in the Boer Wars or whatever. Some would remember Waterloo. I don't know. You name it. There. There's some record somewhere where this guy had his trusty man carry his pannier, and they took it back and emptied it and filled it up again. So you're trying to imagine wealthy people who may have come and stayed at an inn, would they have got a trap to the river, and then where would they have picnicked, etc. And I've even gathered in the minutes, I forget the name, but there was a hut. It wouldn't have been like Halford's, but on the Mottersford beat, but there was a hut there or a shelter. I don't know where it was or what it was built like. I've got to try to find out. So there was a mixture. It was either landed gentry in the area who would probably horse and cart, or by horse, ride there and fish or stay in a local inn. And there would be what they call the parishioners. Now, today, we've got key members that live in Ipswich. One in Ipswich, Ian Hawkins, a very well-known guy in the fishing fraternity. He's looking after all of our invertebrate sampling figures and records and things, and trains the samplers. But he lived in Ipswich. He's now moved to Derbyshire. So we haven't really, he's a bit easier to get to us. But his working parties are doing that training and so on. So Facebook actually now means, unless you constrict it to 50 miles when you're putting out your Facebook thing, but I'm 50 odd miles away, so I'm not classed as a parishioner. All I can do my secretarial role from afar. So all of that has changed. But in all honesty, when I took over what would be October, November 2020, there were 75 members. We've got 120 members now. The club is full. There are 10 what they would call honorary members, which would be a non-paying. So the bailiffs don't pay, and so there's 6 of them and 4 honorary members. So that's 10. So there's 130 members and a waiting list, which I think is a mega success. And that's not down to just me. There's all these people doing all of their bits. So the feedback within the club is one of overall joy with the way it's going. But we've got members are first and foremost in everything that we do. Not to the detriment of the river, so we wouldn't scalp it within an inch of its life just to please an angler. But we do work with, when you get out of the car, there's an easier bit there for less mobile members. And the further away you get, the rougher it gets. If you can do jungle warfare, you can walk a little bit. Don't expect an 80-year-old guy to get out with 2 false knees and a hip and be climbing trees. Is that a long answer? But
it does.
I hope that shows a progression.
It does, and that's really thrilling to hear, because, you know, I do worry about, and I think part of it sometimes, and I've talked about it on here before, that I wonder if the spike that we had in fly fishing in the 70s and 80s is flattening out. So that's making the numbers look a little bit lower. I do hear a little bit that some clubs are struggling with recruitment, but that's wonderful to hear that your club is thriving. Does that mean the extra 2 miles means that you will extend the membership a little bit more?
Yes, there are 2 views. There was a gentleman who was in the club a while ago who was absolutely against this. And I know I always say in social media terms, you end up with little echo chambers, don't you, where you get groups of people who all agree with one another and everything they say is fine. But these groups of people and their interests, it's an extreme example for which I apologise, but it shows that you can get a group of people and they don't seem to broaden their perspective. So what we find is when we look at the recruitment of a club now, and we're trying to attract these different people, the 2 miles of river in and of itself might enable us to go and ask for more members. But some of these groups will say, no, we need less members. We want to pay £400-500 a year and only have 20 of us. Well, who's going to maintain the river? It's just not going to happen. So on that basis, I found that was very disappointing. There was another member who said to me recently, a very, very, very good angler. When I watched him fish, he said, would you like a go? He's a man who fishes with 2 rods, you know. Not at the same time, of course, although I'm sure he could. He said, would you like a go? And I said, it's a privilege to watch you. And I have watched some anglers that are self-proclaimed experts and do casting lessons and teach all sorts of different things. And they're very good because they tell you they are. But as soon as they pass me the rod, I want to do it. This guy, I would never take the rod off him. I would say I'd watch. And he said, quote unquote, the swap tickets in this club are so good, I would never leave it. He said, but I don't want you to get more members because I don't want to find I can't fish when I want. Now, it would be wrong to call it a selfish gene, but there's an element of self-interest in it. But the way I think is, if we've got this 2 miles of water, we could get more people. And they all say more people means we can do more work parties. And I said, have you seen 2 miles of untended double bank fishing? They would need 500 of us. So in some ways, we could have more members. And with 120 we've got at the moment, we counted 100 recorded working party days, volunteer days. They're supposed to do 4 each. And some of these people have done 6, 7 and 8. So the amount of people that participate with work parties, and again, this could relate back to demographics and there being a broader pool of people, the non-parishioners, is rather more difficult. So then there's an education where you've got to say to people, come and do a work party in the morning and fish the afternoon. And as the season progresses, as you know, you've got that bit between midday, late afternoon or early evening rise. we've got to try and educate people to say, come and do both in one day. I do a 110-mile round trip. I go do a work party and I fish in the afternoon. If we have too many members, I can understand you don't want to go and find you can't get on the water. But nobody is complaining about getting to a water and, being stuck. So I think we could get more members, but it's not my decision. It goes to an AGM. I can only make a recommendation. Does that make sense? Long answer. Oh, no, sorry.
This is about you and talking about these things. And it's wonderful to hear, like I said before, that a club is having to have a waiting list and adding to its water. So it's looking out for existing members and potentially new ones as well. So I'm thrilled to hear about that. Is it, to get a sense, I hope you don't mind me asking, what does membership cost to your club?
It's so cheap, it's unbelievable. It's £75 to join, or £77.50 I think now, and it's £155 per annum. We used to have the option for people to join 1st of October at half of the rate, so they could fish the grayling season. So they'd pay the joining fee, which is the same, but only pay half the subs, and then in March they would pay again. But that option is not available because we're full. So that tells you everything, really. But it's down to, I think, the satisfaction of the members in the club. We have churn, like everybody else. It's not quite dead men's shoes, but there's almost that feeling that it's going that way. So it seems we've hit the magic, I think, at the moment. But maybe this is on the back of COVID, and maybe it will calm down. But we haven't quite been this full, so we're hopeful.
That's wonderful to hear. And you mentioned grayling there, and I would like to circle round again about yourself. And grayling, are they a fish that's special for you?
Not for me. I mean, I've got a love-hate relationship with them, really. Karma once got the better of me. When I was a boy, I fished at the Lido on the Nid, I think it was. We were at a campsite. I was about 11. And I wandered down there like a heretic with a bubble float and a worm. Caught a grayling, second cast. Bonked it on the head. I know, and this is where the karma gets in. I climbed up this steep hill, ran out of puff, sat down and sat on a wasp's nest. So I'm a bit wary about grayling. I think they've got connections somewhere. And I'm always wondering whether one would get me back or not. But I do like catching them. They are, but they're not my sport, really. I'm a dry fly guy. I always take the mickey out of these submariners with their nymphs and things like that. It's you can tell me the depth of that water, can you? And how far? Yeah, is it not? Great. Some people can. I just prefer to see a fly I've tied land on the water and a trout take it. And occasionally I will try that underarm cast to get underneath a tree. And you catch a fish like that, and that's brilliant. Or you cast past it and check stop it, and it kicks to the left, and the trout takes it upstream. You can't see it, you hear the splash, and you've got him. And I love that excitement for me on those small streams with those pretty little trout is spectacular. I'm not interested in the big ones and stuff like that, but there is good grayling fishing in the club. And right now we're arranging a grayling match. There's 15 anglers going to be fishing on the 22nd on Pickering Beck. And we'll be trying to see what the numbers of the grayling are like.
I look forward to hearing about that. And also you talked about, your casting techniques, which sound absolutely great. Does that mean that you've always fished that way? Or is this, we often talk about it on here, that as you get a little bit older, we're a lot more relaxed about how we fish. We might choose that rising fish. We might look for the rising fish. Is that how you've always fished, or is this more latterly how you've approached your fishing?
At one point, I was a member of the Derwent Anglers Club, the Yorkshire Derwent, adjacent downstream of Scarborough. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful river, but it's a spate river, and my God, does it come up! You could see trees 10 feet up in the air in the debris up there. But I was on the upper water membership, which was about 115 quid a year, not 400 or 500 it normally was. But I could have 2-day tickets down on the river. I never used them. I just fished the wild bit up the top. I've even got a video of me with an otter, 3 minutes of this otter going around this pool next to me. And whether people think they're good or bad or not, I turned the corner and caught a trout. So he hadn't cleaned the river out. But on that water, the keeper laughingly called me Mr. Whippy. Because I fish a great fast action 6'6" rod with a 3 weight. And you're trying to keep the fly out of the trees. And sometimes you've got to get some propulsion in there. So I maybe got it all wrong. Someone would tell me the timing would be key and everything else. But Mr. Whippy here. But one season, I allegedly broke the record and caught an average of 35 fish. It was about 13 or 14 trips I'd done. So the average was 35. My best was 65 in a day. So that was wonderful. But my technique, they did take the mickey out of me. But I did march and I would crack on. But that was beautiful, beautiful water, not stocked, completely wild fish. You probably wouldn't see anybody. Just wonderful. Yeah, wonderful water.
And you're recalling the numbers of fish. Does that mean you keep detailed diaries of your fishing days and exploits?
No, I'm probably the opposite. There are red letter days you remember. So if you hit a hole in one, you remember. I remember once playing golf and by the third hole I was 5 over par, my usual numpty self, rubbish. This was when Ian Poulter was a young lad, by the way, so it goes back a long while. And on the fourth hole, my business partner rang me and said, "Martin, we've gone bust." I said, "What do you mean we've gone bust? I've got 40-odd people working in this new office we've bought." And he said, "No, we've gone bust. BAE, the last customer, have pulled the plug." I said, "God." So from the fourth hole to the ninth, I was on the phone, feet together, 4-iron, smack, someone tell me where that went, waving people through. And I got to the ninth hole and I'd played 4 under par.
Wow.
On the back 9, I did 72 because I'd solved the problem. So the hedge was the problem. So I can remember red letter days. And one red letter day on the Dutchie was I got at this bend, and I don't photograph out all the fish that I get, but I caught a fish first cast, and I shouted for my buddy who just left me, and he'd have been down past a waterfall, so he didn't hear me. So I thought, I'll take a picture. The timestamp will show, God, look at this straight away. Cast again, got another one, and I hadn't moved. I had 7 fish in 11 minutes. Wild trout. Unbelievable. But I took a picture of them all. But the next twice I went, I blanked. So, these trout are great levelers, but it's just a red letter day. I don't keep those records, but I do have very fond memories of when it went well. And I'm gracious enough to accept I'm not the best of anglers. I'm going to have shit days, and I don't want to talk about those. Holly bushes and things, I could do well with those, but more bushes than fish, that sort of thing.
It's funny, isn't it, when you're showing somebody your home water and, like you say, you've got a buddy down fishing for the first time or a guest or whatever it might be, that you say, well, I had a really nice fish from here, or I've had one from here, and this is where and then you're thinking, don't say that, Pete. Don't say it, just because it's not. And then it's even better when it does play out the way that you hope it will. But there's nothing worse. So I've stopped saying, look, this is a nice little pool. And I've stopped doing that now just to put myself in that sort of position. But I'm the same as you, that I don't keep a diary. I remember everything. And sometimes I will. And I hope there'll be a time where I sit in a chair, close my eyes and think of those days on the river. That's how I've got it planned, rather than sitting down and reading it. But for listeners, this is an interesting one. We were having a conversation off mic before we started recording, and Martin showed me some beautiful classic salmon flies that were left to him, and we had the debate as to whether you would fish them or not. Have you come to, since we talked about it, have you thought a little bit more? Are you still in the position, I don't know, I know you showed me 2 of them or 3 of them. Are you in the position where you would change that you thought, well, I might try them, or it's just you're not going to?
No, definitely. These are such wonderful flies, and the gentleman who gave me these 2 flies means so much to me that they will get framed properly. I'm not going to do a bodge job. I think one's a silver doctor. You would probably know better than me, and the other one might, I don't know. is there a black doctor or something? But these two flies were from Norway. So that they're not hand tied by some lady in a croft in Scotland or something that Prince Charles goes to get them. There's none of that behind it. But they're just so beautiful. The structure of them, the amount of tying and dressing that's gone into it, I think it's the right word, dressing, isn't it? The amount of dressing that's been done, it just amazes me, the beauty of it and how they've got it all in there. One day I will probably be brave enough to try and get the materials and see if I could tie one, but I think it would look like a yard broom when I've done it. A pipe cleaner or something.
I think part of me thinks, well, perhaps he's looking down on you thinking, go on, get them wet. And is it not worth fishing them once just to say that you put them in the water and then, it's high risk, but there is the chance that some magic might happen, but also that you've given them a go. Because I often talk to people about bamboo rods and they say, oh, I'm frightened they'll build them, or people, rod builders who have built rods, and people don't even put them on the water because they're too afraid. And they say they've spent so much time investing in building these things for the end user. I know yours is a slightly different story, but they spent so much time, it breaks their heart that they don't get fish. So all of the stuff I've got, I fish. I've got some flies, not quite the same by AK Best, and I can see some of them, I fish them. And I have lost some. I've done some quite dangerous climbing in trees to get some out that have got stuck in there. But Emma handed me a small box of them once, and it was a present. Before I opened it, she said, "Right, promise me you're going to use these." I had no idea what it was, and I said, "I promise." So I fish with them. So I just wonder if just that once, give them one swing. Could be in a nice, easy pool where you're not going to get snagged, you're not going to throw it in a tree, and then you can say, "Okay, now I can frame them."
You've done a good sales job, but no, the memory of Gordon. Should I lose one of those flies, I don't think I would ever forgive myself. And looking at them reminds me of this wonderful man that was in his club from 1960 something. He was the treasurer for 28 years, and he was eventually the president of the club. He was a shipbroker in his younger days. At age 91, he drove himself all the way to the Dee in Scotland and caught the only salmon of the week on those beats. An incredible man. And at age 92, he suddenly rang me and said, I've got to give up the treasurer's job. He said, this was like June last year. And he said, I shall be okay to help the next person do the job. He was so planned and organised, and everything. I could go on forever about Gordon, but I won't. But he just means so much to me. He's one of those people that I've been blessed to meet and could have counted him as a friend. And throughout the secretarial role, I don't think there was a day that we didn't speak. And he would probably stop any excesses I might have, and his counselling was good. So he was my go-to guy, and those will just be there. I don't mind if I got two others, I might fish those, but not those two, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a fair enough argument. So I thought I'd
too cowardly.
Yeah, no, I thought I'd try just to see, and wondered what he'd make of it and go from there. But that's absolutely fair. Let's move on. And like I said, when I was researching, I couldn't believe it was 3 years ago that we first spoke on the podcast. And I believe after appearing on the first time that you were contacted by a number of fishing clubs for advice. That must have been pleasing to hear in some respects, mustn't it, for you?
Yes. I mean, if you recall, when you asked me if I'd do a podcast, I think it was based on comments I'd been making for one of the southern streams. I learned to fly fish at Latimer, the lake at Latimer, which is fed by the Chess, I believe. And I think it was the Chess that was having problems from memory. But all I would do with those sort of things on Facebook was try and give that little bit of experience that I'd got from the Thames Water manual writing days when I owned the business that wrote the manuals for them. Because sometimes people miss the obvious, Is it at that time? Not many people were knowing to look to see if it was dry weather and spilling, and that kind of thing. Or was it screened or not screened, etc., etc. So I would try to give them encouragement, support. I'd praise them when they had a win. I would first to put a thumbs up for them. And then you contacted me and asked me if I would come and do a podcast. And I said, I've neither the face for television or the voice for radio. So I apologize to anyone listening to my dulcet tones now. But then you said, listen to this guy, Fergal Sharkey, who we all know and love. And I got caught in a traffic jam the next day. Just coincidence. And I had the time to listen to the 80 minutes or whatever his podcast was. I told you, hey, I like what he did and what he had to say and how he did it. Yeah, I could do that. I can support that. I could add another perspective in support of his arguments. And I think it went well. So when there was a chairman of one of the big rivers down your way that began with T.
Teen?
Anyway,
Teen?
this chap. No. Oh gosh, it was the longest river in Devon, I think.
Tamar?
That's it. And there was a chairman from one of the clubs there. I think he'd been a stockbroker or something. Very nice gentleman. He rang and was just quizzing me and what did I think of this? What did I think of that? So I probably did a lot of questions and answers from them because they had queries and I would try and give them a perspective. Then Ashley Smith contacted me and I think, is it Professor Dunn that's doing the stats for dry spills, early spills, that sort of thing. He was on the Gone Fishing programme. The two of them were in the hut. And funnily enough, on the desk was all these blue files, and one of them was Pickering Fishery Association waters. But we had a chat as well. So it was nice to see this reinforcement of not activism, but people wanting to do something about it. And it shocked me that a lot of people didn't know what I took for granted as being basic things that we should be pushing for. Yeah, so in that sense, that was nice that I was able to spread a little bit. And I hope from today we can do that again. It'd be nice.
Absolutely. So let's start with your river. And then this will give, I think, listeners a sense of the route, the things that they're having to, or you're having to deal with. And going from there, and all the other sort of organisations around that, the EA, Yorkshire Water, and the Water Framework Directive, as well as Theresa Coffey. But what is the latest with your river? So the situation, it may be worth, if you haven't listened to it already, listening to the previous podcast I did with Martin. And there were issues with a sewage treatment works. And of course, many rivers have sewage treatment works, if not all of them. The main rivers have them, at least one on the system. And Martin tackled that and the storm overflows. What is the latest with your river, and where are you standing? What has progressed since we, if anything, since we last spoke?
Wow, yeah. Well, there are two rivers that basically I've become involved with. The first one, at about the time of our first podcast, was Thornton Beck Lower. And the pressure that we put on them, they spent 2.4 million, I think, between 2 and 2.4 million, with a contractor called Warden Burke, who moved into this field. All of the huts appeared and so on, and another Bailey Bridge got put over the beck. And they started work on the site. They added phosphate removal, big tick, well done them. They weren't going to change the inlet works, but they did, and that has turned out to be catastrophic. So the information that I've seen, and I managed to get my hands, they shared it with me, but this was encrypted information, so I couldn't even copy it. And I'd signed a thing that I wouldn't, take copies and do whatever. But one of the typical things that was not their fault, but it was a typical spill, was they'd added a penstock, which is those slidey gates that come up and down like a guillotine. There used to be big hand wheels on the top, didn't there? This one was automated, but it was on the outlet of the inlet works. So the inlet works filled up with influent, would get screened and would go out through this door and off to the full flow to treatment pumps and the 3X pumps to storm tanks if needed. But this door had fallen shut, and the engineer who'd gone to inspect had said the micro switch had failed, the limit switch, so it had unscrewed and the shaft had come out the threaded nut on the door and it dropped like a proverbial guillotine. So the inlet works filled right the way up, and the overflow from an inlet works is what they call a 6x channel. And that 6x spill was going to happen imminently. But that would be illegal because it's not heavy rainfall or melting snow. Not that that makes any difference because no one does anything, which is another story altogether. But it proves a point as well that the inflow into the inlet works isn't monitored. So I can't tell you how many litres per second are going in. You can only tell this level P with an ultrasonic detector on it. And it can be spilling 6x, which should that one be 102 litres per second, but it might only be 20 litres per second going in. So therefore, there's a fault, and it's an illegal spill due to a maintenance problem. Now, you can't tell someone off for a maintenance problem, but had they maintained it properly, that was a new works, so it's probably likely to be a faulty piece of kit. But how many sites have got that faulty piece of kit, and how good at Yorkshire Water at finding out how many faults there are? One discussion I had was it had even been mooted that they were going to get Amazon to send all of their parts to all of their sites.
Dear me.
Well, I think that would be brilliant because Amazon would know how many of these bloody actuators they're sending in an instance. You know, you could interrogate them in a second. My son-in-law has a business delivering for Amazon. They've got 65 drivers, and you know what they can do is absolutely unbelievable. But the telemetry, the Internet of Things and things like that isn't being used properly on these sewage works. So that works now has got this inlet works, and that's all supposed to be working fine. But now it's blowing the manhole cover by the beck. So the inlet, the influent coming in, can't get into the works. The pipe's too small. So the water backs up this hill from 3 villages outlying where their pumping stations work. Dry weather again, no rain. And it can pop the manhole cover. Now they've welded it shut. And I said, but why? What's the cause? Tell me why. Just stick a Band-Aid on it. Why have you cut yourself? And it's literally forcing poo out the holes where the handles go for the lid, like Play-Doh. It's coming out like Play-Doh. The pressure is so great. So last night I sent 20 different incident reports to the EA and said, can you please tell me what you have done with these 20 incident reports? And they were everything from rainbow trout escaped in our river to, blah, 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 blah. You don't get any answer from them. So sadly, when we'd had a 9-month spill, that's the worst I've heard of, by the way, 9 months perpetual spill on Thornton Beck, and it's a separate storm overflow, so it can't be confused. You can't say, oh, well, it wasn't. It was treated water. If it's coming out of there, that's storm. And it was groundwater. So Yorkshire Water, to their credit, investigated it. We kept on to them all the time, and they cameraed it, and they checked it, cleaned it. They blew ice down it, so there weren't chemicals used, cleared all the blockages, took the stuff away, and then they spray lined it, and there's no more groundwater effect. So it's now not spilling constantly, but it pops the manhole now and chucks the shit straight in the river. So it's constant, and that's just Thornton Beck. On Pickering Beck, on Costa, the first sewage works was installed in 1932 by the Urban District Council, and that was at the top, near the top of the river. After a very, very bad event, which obviously you can picture it, they decided they would move it further downstream. Okay, so we take what's bad and we'll just move it further down. Each time they would dredge or regrade 900 yards of river, so the gradient of the river is lost. When they built the 2 mills in the 1700s, half the river flow went to the west. So Oxfolds, as we're calling it, the top end, has half the flow. There's a drain that's parallel to it that takes water, which the trout farmer at the top can govern. And the IDB have said nobody needs that drain cleaning anymore, the Inland Drainage Board, because everybody's on mains water. So in theory, they could just shut that off and put that water back in the river to help. So now the sewage works had another incident, and it got moved in the 80s or 90s, I think, to where it is currently, where it's causing all sorts of problems. And this is driving the fish out. but it's a problem that even if it's treated sewage and it's not storm, when it rains, of course, then it has to storm. It's designed to do it. They all do it. Let's all accept it. But the Rye backwater rises, so Costa Beck looks tidal. It actually looks like it's slowing down, rises and comes back towards you, heading upstream. Now, at that point in time, the beck must be flowing, otherwise it would just fill the fields and go. But there's something there, the dynamics, the hydromorphology of the river, or whatever they would call it, fluid dynamics. I think it delays the passage of whatever is in that river, and then the fish disappear. One can imagine a grayling with its left fin over its nostrils and swimming for its life downstream. So they try to come up. We've got fish trying to come back, but they're fighting pollution, sediment, this sewage, slugs of sewage. But if they get up past that, over the crump weir, then all the spawning grounds are impacted by the sediment that's in there because of all this dredging. And we'll come to the JR and then I can explain what we'll do about it. But that's the current situation.
So how does that look comparable? Because I know you've talked about bug surveys when we were talking about fishing. How is that comparable to when we last spoke? The state of the river, does that mean it's actually worse, or does it mean that you're more aware of what's happened? So Yorkshire Water have spent this 2.4 million. They've made a mess of that. Does that mean that 2.4 million they might have just put on red and see what comes up at the casino?
Well, there's a the gentleman who I was dealing with originally has moved on, and he lived in Edinburgh and he'd been a director with Veola, and Veola were winning contracts, the private finance initiative contracts with Scottish Water. So as you recall, Scottish Water didn't privatise, it stayed nationalised. But of course, it didn't get any funding. So the only avenue to improve the works was private finance initiative. And this gentleman that I was dealing with was kind enough to explain to me, and he was trying to educate me, and I think not to get out of doing anything, but explaining just these are the realities we face in the water company. So with Scottish Water, it was very clever. I've never thought of nationalising the water companies, but they could do a hybrid model if they didn't want to nationalise it. They should use PFI, and for the following reason. If he won a contract for, say, 20 years, the storm tanks would be glass lined for cleaning purposes because it was efficient for them. If they got it for 2 years, you get a cheap concrete tank. Okay. Now at Pickering, we used Google maps, and we could see one of the tanks has got vegetation growing in it. It wasn't even being used. Yet it's supposed to be 65 litres per head of population storage. So Scottish Water were very clever. In their contract, if you missed a consent, you got fined half a day's money or a day's money, which came out, I think he said, £500,000. If I was the finance director, I'd be the proverbial Luddite throwing clogs into the screens so I could save millions on my bill. Yeah. But did you hear me mention SEPA? Ofwat? Anybody else? Didn't matter. If you missed that consent, it was like a bank overdraft. That's the agreement. You pass that, you pay. Why is there all this gnashing and wailing and negotiating? So if there were PFI contracts, the water companies would police their suppliers and fine them. But for some reason, the EA is incapable of doing that, even though it's their job. Isn't that interesting? That was a new one on me. I never thought, how could it work? But that's it. So if they didn't privatise the companies, Thames Water, for instance, Thames Water have framework agreements and people go and build their plants and some operate them. But if all of them were done like it and they had the consent and they said, if you fail this consent, you get fined, what water problem? I think in a year it would be fixed. That's my suggestion.
You got my vote. You have got my vote.
Well, I've got a letter here from David Davis, my MP locally here, not the one for Pickering. And the letter he got back from Rachel McLean is the MP, Minister of State for Housing and Planning, because I dared to suggest to them they've got an own goal by building 150,000 houses. That should have been a success. Well done, you. But at the same time, they shoot themselves in the foot by watering down the environmental regulations. So I said, why is it you guys don't join the dots? My child of 12, when he was 12, would play Sim City. If he was building a new city, you would soon know that if the place is on fire, the firemen are on strike because you haven't paid them, or people are leaving because there's no library or theatre, or whatever. They have to join the dots up. The children can do it. I think politicians should be made to play Sim City and be able to beat a 12-year-old. Otherwise, they can't make any decisions. But she was giving me all this levelling up and all this rubbish here. And all I'd said was, make sure it's 65 litres per head of population storage, or you can't build anything. Do away with the 2 hours to fill, because that's the other one. They never have 65 litres per second, but they say, it takes 2 hours to fill. That's the other get out clause. That's fine if you want to use a sclerotic pump that's worn, but if you put the brand new pump in, according to the functional design spec, it'd probably fill in 40 minutes. So they wouldn't pass the consent. So this is one of the things that they've missed, that it actually pays the water companies to use worn pumps to fill the storm tanks.
What does that mean for your river? What does that mean that the next steps are for you and for people listening, for clubs, chairmen, secretaries, members? What is it that they should be focusing on? What is it that they should continually be looking to do? I think you've given quite a big clue about the emails that you sent last night, but what else should they be doing? Should we still be pushing hard with the EA as well?
Right, again, another good question. In its simplest terms, I think some fishing clubs should have theme music, which would be along the lines of "There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza." Things just go round and round and round. Somebody rang me the other night for a joke, and he said, "I'm sorry to dump this on you." I said, "What's that?" He said, "I was fishing the other day," he said, "and I looked down and my bootlace was undone. Sorry to burden you." That was one of the more welcome calls. But that's part of the job, and I understand that. But what I think we've got to do as secretaries is educate people. So what I try to do is, on the back of a passbook, there's a hotline number, pollution hotline number. Every club should be putting that on there. When you ring that number, they will treat things differently to if you walked in the local EA office and asked them about it. Because if it's not Cat 1, they won't deal with it. They just get written in a diary and thrown away, perhaps. But it's a bit like going to see your doctor or calling 111. The 111 is like a pilot's checklist, the way they go down it, but then everything kicks into being. So the same thing happens here. If you ring this pollution hotline number, the process is completely different, because they've got to answer the things, they've got to show the outcome of the things, and it's measured. Whereas that doesn't happen when you walk in an office and see Billy Bob, the fishery officer, from round the corner. And I will say again, I always say this, I don't believe there's any EA person goes to work to do a bad job. I don't believe that. But as a system, as an organisation, it isn't working. So I modify this slightly. There is an ICS email address. So it's ICS at whatever, environment.gov.uk or whatever it is, or -gov. And you have that email address ready. Put the photos in there, the evidence of the pollution or whatever it is you're reporting, grid reference or what 3 words location, have it there. When you ring them, read out your email of what you've got. They'll give you an incident number. And you put that in the subject line, and then you send that off with them still on the line. And then when they get it, they go, "Oh, I see, I've got it now." And you can hear the change in the tone of voice. So it's gone from someone bored shitless with yet another call about pollution to someone actually giving a shit and sending pardon my French, and giving an email with the details in. And that triggers a whole different raft of behaviour. I'm not saying I'm happy with the behaviour, because the EA is still failing us, but that's the best way to do it. Then the secretary in the club should be copied in, and at the end of the year, we can do what I did last night, send all of those off again and say, "You haven't told me how this has gone on, give me a report." And it makes it efficient, but you haven't let go, and there's a follow-up, and it's easy to follow up. Complex answer, but
that's great, and I think for listeners, they'll be able to follow that as a guideline to go. So, does it mean for you that the battle's continuing on your rivers?
Yes. Thornton Beck is the easier one, because the gentleman at Yorkshire Water is trying to do his best. There is a tendency in the water companies at the moment to talk about greening things up. So instead of having a tank somewhere, they're going to have a lagoon in a field. Brilliant. What have you done to fix the works in the first place? Nothing. So stop talking about green stuff. Do that if you wish. Talk to me about the maintenance products. And at Yorkshire Water, they've got a new training academy, a new training manager, and I think they're going to see about splitting up the trades. So instead of multi-discipline people, you'll have an electrician, a maintenance guy, etc., etc. And that would be very different. But the maintenance processes are wrong. That we found once a storm tank was full, and it had been so full for so long, it was green. The water had got algae in it, and there were sanitary towels floating in there. So A, it hadn't been screened, B, it wasn't emptying, which meant they were operating illegally, because if it rained, that capacity wasn't there. It was taken, it was full, like trying to put another pint in a glass that's already full. So the pump had gone. So they came to change the pump, and we were doing a work party, so I was keeping an eye on them. And I said, oh, you can't change the pump. They've got the crane there, new pump wrapped up, and they were going. He said, yeah, someone had dropped the chain in the last time. So you imagine the tank was full, someone changed the pump, lowered it in place, dropped the chain, went, oh dear. But they didn't write it down anywhere. So the next time the pump broke, but do you know the cost? They had to send a tanker to then empty it, and then the other guys come back again. And another instance was a gearbox went that this manager was trying to get to run beyond its mean time between failures to save money on the capital. The gearbox cost 3,000. In the time it took to get a replacement, because it had been run over life and failed, £60,000 in tankers.
Wow.
And the companies know this, but somehow they seem incapable of fixing it. So hence, it wasn't a joke that they had considered Amazon logistically to say, I need a pump here, and it weighs 1.5 hundredweight, so it would arrive on a high-ab when the guys are there, and everything would just work. It would go seamlessly. But where's the mentality, the guy that drops the chain and doesn't write it on a blackboard or send an email and say, next time this is empty, can someone get the chain out? That's the bit that gets me. All of this is nonsense, because if it rained, the sewage would go straight in there, and we've missed completely 2 hours. It's going to go in 5 minutes. So, and again, that would be illegal, but they get away with it because the EA hasn't got a clue how to stop it. Yeah, that's a rant, isn't it?
No, that's right. And this is a subject that is worthy of a rant, so I will happily listen to it.
Did you want me to tell you about the judicial review?
Yes, please.
Right. 12th of July, we had our judicial review. The week before, I believe, was Wild Fish and Nick Measham and co. doing a great job trying to do their bit to hold them to account. I've seen the report. They've had their ruling handed down, and Nick kindly shared it with me. And I got to page 55, para 255, like you do when you're a sad git. And I noticed they were using Batnik as an excuse not to do some work and to put it into what they call a PR, the pricing review, which takes 5 years, and then another 5 years to do the job. So they kicked the can down the road 10 years using Batnik. Now, what Batnik stands for is best available technology, not exceeding excessive cost. So if you want to build a sewage works and I want to build one, but I'm going to do better than you because I'm going to get Rolex to come and build this one for me, and yours is cheap and cheerful. Actually, yours might be better because it's best available technology. It does the job, has to do the job, but not exceeding excessive cost. I don't need a gold-plated spanner, you know. And they mistakenly, Judge Holcomb was using that in his summation, that protected them from having to do it right now. Batnik is about how much money you spend when you buy something. It's not whether you do it or not do it. So they've misunderstood it. I've told Nick, had a chat with him, and we've had a conversation since, and he seems to think that I'm right, that's an incorrect assumption. Whether that goes to an appeal or not, I don't know. Our judicial review had a wonderful justice of Justice Levens, Dame Natalie Levens. I was trying to think who she reminded me of, and it was almost like she was flirting with her hair sometimes. She was very dramatic. And if she said stop, people turned to stone, this stern voice. And then afterwards she would smile and warm the room up with a little wave of her hand, flick of her hair, and continue, She had 1,600 pages to read, so it was a lot for her to keep up with. And then I got it second day. She reminded me of Emma Thompson. So it's like having an actress Emma Thompson as a judge with all the lovely acting going on. It was fantastic. But two things occurred that were really meaningful. Miss Pindham, the barrister for Theresa Coffey, got her telling off. And Dame Leven said, "Stop. That's an opinion. I'm not interested in your opinion. Keep them to yourselves. We're here to see if you have followed the law."
Lovely.
Wow,
yeah.
there's a win. So 2 hours later, Mr. Fraser, the barrister for the EA, he started to talk, and I have to loosely paraphrase this. Again, the Emma Thompson dark side came out. "Stop. You're now entering into levels of legalistic sophistry, the likes of which I've had the pleasure never to encounter in all my years. And don't do it again." Well, I had to look it up, but of course she was accusing him of lying. And he was red-faced. At another point, she said, "Well, I've got every sympathy with the anglers. I can't see here how you blah, 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 blah." So on a grand scheme of things, I had a good, warm feeling about it. But our judicial review was about the RBMP, the River Basin Management Plan. And we overheard their solicitor saying to one of their barristers, "You've got to make sure the judge understands if these buggers win this, we've got over 6,000 water bodies that we've got to reassess." It's that important to them. Can she be got at, the judge? I very much doubt it. She seemed a very honourable lady, and she didn't miss a trick. However, we're 9 weeks late with the review. She'd promised first week of August. So on the second day at lunchtime, I caught Mark Scott, the manager of the RBMP group. He's the manager for the River Basin Management Plan and the water assessments. And I think I got my point across. It wouldn't be heard in court. It wouldn't affect anybody. I wasn't nobbling a witness, but it's his job. And I said, "You have lowered the ecological potential for fish to poor because it's a heavily modified water body. Yet, you, the EA, say it can't be modified, but you've modified the top 3 fields and won a Wild Trout Trust Award. Can you explain that?" Now, when they did the top 3 fields, I can see no evidence at all that they looked at the river levels other than give it 2 coats of looking at. So when they added gravels and did bits and pieces in there and added structures which would raise the water level, and it's amazing, as you know, you put a groin or two in, it backs up for hundreds of yards. So we would say that from where we want to do the work down to the bridge at Costa Mill Cottages is about 1,200 yards. And we estimate there's about 8 foot of fall. So we could get quite a good gradient on there and re-energize it. But we would do it with GNSS heads on sticks for proper surveying, satellite surveying. I think it picks up 8 satellites or something, this thing. You can even have the stick at an angle and it reads to within a centimetre. But this is like $5,000 for one of these things. So we've got to get the funding for that. And I have approached my contacts at Yorkshire Water to see if they can lend us one, if they can help us to buy one, putting a guilt factor on them. And they've gone off to consider that. So then we can go and make a bathymetric survey, although it be a very basic, the point analysis would be a bit smaller, but we'll try and take 4 measurements every yard going up the river. So we've about 4,800 measurements to make. And we will know if we were to regrade that in a slope, imagine it a straight line, we should know whether it would raise the water levels or not. And if there's any doubt or risk that it would, we would scrape that bit out and remove it, clay or whatever it's down to now because they've had the gravels out, and then we would have the gravels back. So whereas the EA did it and flooded the field, we would say, well, we would do it, but we wouldn't flood the field because we're going to be grown up about it. I see you smiling.
Oh, that's beautifully put. And I think there's so much in there. The judicial review, I cannot wait. I hope you share with the world how that one plays out as soon as we get to hear about that one. And, you know, this for listeners, we've spoken well over an hour now, but for listeners, this is, you know, if you're listening to this, there's a high chance. I know I get people who listen to this who don't even fish, but they will be interested in what people like Martin are doing. And if this pressure can be applied in a number of places, it just goes to show, and it takes dedicated people like Martin and others to do this, to help push things on, because it's just not going to change, Martin, is it, if we don't do anything?
No, sadly, it's not. I mean, another very sad tale I've got here. There was a manager at the EA, and I can say her name because I think she's wonderful. I did the first meeting I had with her, and she's got a regulatory background, which was quite exciting. We more or less concluded it with saying, well, we need to know what issues there are with Acosta. Brackets, but they're already known, largely. 2, what do we do to fix it? 3, where's the money coming from? And 4, who's going to actually do the fixing? 3 and 4 might switch the other way. Who's doing the fixing? How much would it cost? Where's the money coming from? So the JR came about, where we'd had enough, really. Nothing to do with her. She was helping and we had regular meetings and it was going well. And then the next time she spoke to me, it was, well, I can't talk to you now. She said it's going through the judicial review process. So really we were in purdah. Maybe an inappropriate word to use, but from a political sense, where we're not allowed to speak to anybody. And it would have to go through the lawyers. Well, I don't believe that, because they've still got their legislative duties to fulfill and the regulatory duties. So just because we're taking them to court doesn't mean to say, you know, if you take the police to court, doesn't mean to say they don't have to point the radar gun at speeders, does it? You know. So we had that conversation, but then she said, it's very complicated, Martin. To which I lost my patience. I said, look, I've heard this before from your previous incumbents. They've been okay. And then as soon as they get to the point where they talk to a lawyer, they're told to tell us it's complicated. Well, it's not. There are 7 faults with the Costa. The major faults. If you get rid of those, the river will fix itself. They can be done in parallel altogether or serially. Good idea, start at the top. They're measuring a drain at the moment for agricultural pollution, and it's 1.5 miles downstream. What about the one at the very top, which they blame is the major source of the silt? So they're doing it all backwards. So I said to her, it's not complicated. You could do this serially over a few years, or you could do it all together, but it would be fixed. I did write a service bulletin once for someone to fit the tactical collision avoidance system to Concorde, which in essence is 2 planes approaching at 4 times the speed of sound. One turns left slightly and the other one turns right slightly. They both turn right slightly and miss. Now, fitting that, testing that was complicated. This is just 7 bloody problems with a bit of water. So it's not complicated, and I do not appreciate someone trying to pull the wool over our eyes.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a shame. And then, of course, Rebecca Powell was in the press saying they don't need any more powers. They've got all the powers that they need. But why aren't they using them? And a typical example of where I think this is an abject failure, which is shameful. They own a trout farm, which is sublet to a trout farmer. So the EA owns the trout farm from the National River Authority days, I think. And we've got rainbows escaping into Costa Beck. So we've got wild fish in there because we've had them scale sampled and tested at the Tweed Foundation. 5 out of 6 fish were wild and 1 was possibly. Those were brown trout. And yet we'd put 100 stocked fish in there just to get the members fishing. So we never caught, I think we caught 8 stocked fish. But it was the announcement to get people hefted to that water again. That's why we did it. Yet if we had rainbows escape from one of our lakes into Thornton Beck, we could be fined up to £32,000. Yet these trout are escaping from one of 2 trout farms. And they said, well, we've inspected their grills, they're fine. I said, well, what are they doing then? Flying out? Somebody's either dumping them in there or they're escaping. There's no other way around it. And one of them is one of your trout farms. So there's a vested interest there that you need to regulate your tenant. I throw my hands in here.
Yeah, that's absolutely extraordinary. And this is why I think this is such an important podcast for people to listen to, because this stuff is going to continue happening if we don't continue to add pressure to people to look at these things more closely. And as you can hear, that Martin is going way beyond the call of duty to discover, to learn, to find out about these things. And I hope it will inspire others to pick up the gauntlet and run with this as well, because it's clearly something that isn't going away. We see the headlines of water companies saying, well, we're going to spend a lot of money in the infrastructure, but clearly the infrastructure is still broken. It's not getting fixed. So I hope this acts as some form of inspiration for people. Martin, it's been wonderful to speak with you. Thank you for so much candor. Thank you for so much honesty. If people do want help and advice, how can they get hold of you?
They can reach me initially by email. It's hon, short for honorary, .sec, short for secretary. So hon.sec at pickeringfishery, or one word, .co.uk. And I think Mondays and Tuesdays are difficult for me. I have a day job with a company. I'm an HR director for them, and it's a bit busy at the moment. But Monday, Tuesday evenings, I can usually pick things up. But those are the 2 days when I really can't help, unless it's very, very, very urgent. If they put urgent in it and there's some crisis going on, then I can usually squeeze a quick call in. And if I could, one last thing I would wanted to say, if possible. I'm a member of 2 clubs. One of them is the Holland District Angling Society, which I thought I'd rather cut my right arm off than see them take over the Blackburn Welfare Waters. And I eat my words, or my thoughts. They are the most fantastic club. They have done one of the most brilliant jobs on that water. It's an absolute delight what they do, both for getting youngsters involved in the club and the training, etc. So well organised. I can only sing their praises. My wife is frightened that I get involved with them. And I said, I have got no intention of getting involved at all. And I haven't. And I've been a member there 4 years now. And I don't get involved. I go on the fish and I come away, and that's the end of that. But that's great. And a lot of clubs are like that. And members have got the same contact as I have, so that they're not involved. They don't have to be involved. They've paid to fish. They go to fish. It's great. You go to a pub, you buy a pint. You're not interested in how the dishwasher works and all that sort of stuff. But in a club like this at Pickering, somehow it got in a parlous state. And there were some vested interests in there where things were driving people the wrong way. So there was work going to be done worth £90,000 to put 2 meanders in a field. And people like me were already looking into the possibility of putting our own lake in our own field. We owned that field. Now, 2 small meanders would do the job. And I've done an awful lot of river work. I'm not Charles Rangeley Wilson, but I've got a straight piece of beck at Thorntley Dale where you could put a rubber duck on it and play Mozart as it waltzes from left to right. But that's within the straight channel. And that little beck has moved hundreds of tons of gravel on its own. Where we'd put revetments, you can't see them for gravel. And it's a gentle stream. So I'm learning more about how you can encourage the stream just to start to move, and then the dynamics takes over, and then it starts to waltz. I call it waltzing. Get a river to waltz. It's brilliant. Now, what we've found was that this need to put these bends in was by someone who happened to be an officer in this club, allegedly, and was also a trustee of a trust that was going to do the work. And with £90,000 at stake, I, as a businessman, was thinking, you can't be involved. You've got to recuse yourself from this. You shouldn't be involved at all. So I had the EA going to give me 12 hours of free consultation time to see about how we got the flood risk dealt with, which would have been possible. There was even the argument you can't put a lake in there, it would take too much water from the beck. Well, Pickering Beck's 3 times the size of Thornton Beck, and Thornton Beck feeds one of our best lakes. So it's not an issue. It's a non-issue. And that was a real problem. So what I would say to any of the clubs, this itch I've got to scratch, if you've got a club where you've just got members, a bit of water, and you go and you fish, fill in the returns, have a annual general meeting and a meal afterwards or whatever, brilliant. If you've got a problem like we have, the right bank of Costa Beck has been fenced off, catchment sensitive funding. I've asked the farmer, do you want to move the fence? No. Do you want to ask me if I want the fence kept there because we can't fish and we've bought the fishing? And that's just one thing. Another guy blocking off a right of way, etc., etc. A clerk, a minute taker, will not do the job. And the clubs, if they're in crisis, the first thing they need to do is get someone with general management experience, some legal comprehension. I'm a barrack room lawyer, not a lawyer. And you've got to be able to dedicate the time to it, because otherwise you might as well give up the club. And the last thing I would leave them with is a constitution, the rules. Our rules in 5 said we had a chairman, a secretary, and a treasurer. But somehow we had a vice chairman. Now, it wasn't that person's fault, and I got shouted at for saying there's no such thing as a vice chairman. And then I was told, well, we'll just need to amend the rules. And I said, well, that's fine, but Rule 18 says you've got to have an AGM and 2/3 of those members present have got to vote it in. And somehow the amateur has taken over what these gentlemen used to do in the old days. I can see more rigour and stricture in the 1800s than there is now. It's all just what you do, go down the pub, have a couple of pints and agree a lease with somebody. And that's a shame. This club deserved better. And that's why it was down at 75 people and on its heels. And now, thanks to the help and the support of the committee and a wonderful chairman in Will Terry, we'll make sure every man has his say. And he makes sure that if there's a quiet person there, he's the kind of chairman that say, what do you think? And he doesn't miss a trick. And it's restored the democracy in the club. And I think if there are any other clubs out there and you see any hints of this going on, be brave, get the rules out, have a look at them, get the committee changed if you have to, and make sure that you get that thing right. And then your club will survive with Facebook, good campaigns, good focus, and looking after your members, it will work. But you've got to get rid of these vested interests and make sure you follow the rules and don't be frightened.
What a wonderful way to finish. What a lovely look at how a club could be run. And I think that's some wonderful advice. Martin, it's been wonderful to have you back on the Fly Culture podcast once more. Thank you so much for being such a great guest.
Thank you.
Everyone, this has been the Fly Culture podcast. I'm watching Martin with his dog has appeared on his lap now as well. But thank you, everyone, for listening to this edition. I think there's loads in this. We've run over a little bit time-wise, but I think it's worth it. And these issues aren't going to go away. And just to keep them fresh in your mind, there are things you can do. And I think Martin has given perfect inspiration for doing that. So, everybody, thank you so much for listening to the Fly Culture podcast.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly published magazine owned and run by fly anglers. When it comes to fly fishing, we've got you covered.